Welcome everyone on Zoom. This is the 7th monthly deep dive and Emerge Law Group series about the Oregon Psilocybin Services Act. My name is Sean Clancy. I'm a business and intellectual property lawyer. I was part of the Measure 109 drafting and research team, and I'll be your moderator and MC today. In this series, for those of you who've been attending, as you know, we take the deep dive into the finer details of Oregon's Psilocybin Services Act, or as we still call it, Measure 109. We kind of go beyond just the basic framework, assuming that people have a working understanding of the Act, you know, and the manufacturer, service center, facilitator, laboratory kind of structure, and then we kind of dig into the details of how this might actually start to operate and what it'll look like. So today's topic is broad because there's been a lot that's been happening this year. So we're just talking about mid-year updates. We've got local politics. We've got final recommendations from the Psilocybin Advisory Board. Everyone now knows about the Higher Education Coordinating Commission and a smattering of other topics. So rather than focus on one thing, we're just doing mid-year updates, kind of checking in about where the Psilocybin Services program is today. So yeah, as always, we've got Dave Kopilak here co-hosting. Dave is an experienced business lawyer and the primary drafter of Measure 109. And today we're also lucky to have Sam Chapman joining us. Sam was the campaign manager for Measure 109. No small task, considering that involved first gathering individual signatures during a pandemic and lockdowns and all that. And then beyond that, campaigning during the pandemic to get the measure passed while COVID was still raging. But Sam has continued working in his capacity as a drug policy expert, working with the measure. He's the executive director of the Healing Advocacy Fund. That's a nonprofit organization that's been supporting the implementation of the psilocybin services program, doing education and advocacy in all kinds of capacities. And he's probably one of the most knowledgeable people in the state, if not maybe the most knowledgeable about the act and where it's going and who's got things going on with it. So before we get started with our discussion, I'm going to cover the ground rules kind of how this format works. And for anyone who hasn't attended before, of course, please remember to stay on mute if you're not speaking. So we are recording this event because we intend to post the first portion of it online. The second portion of it is a Q&A. So we don't intend to use any audio or video from the Q&A to post. So that portion of the event, as long as you're not speaking up in the beginning portion, you won't end up on our YouTube page. The Q&A is intended to be more conversational in nature and sort of a safe space to discuss the Psilocybin Services Act and any related issues. So we'll just ask everyone to please remain open to different viewpoints and be respectful. We don't anticipate having to use the mute function, but we can if we need to. Yeah, but just please be mindful if your microphone's on. We've allocated 2 hours for the event today, so we can have an extensive and lively Q&A. We do have quite a few registrants and attendees, so to keep everything as streamlined as possible, we'll have sort of this format for the Q&A. If you have a question or comment, what we'd like you to do is one of a few things. One is you could state that you have a question or a comment in the chat box, and then I will note that and put you in the queue and sort of call on you to speak up, and we'll hope you'll come on camera and use your microphone and speak and join the conversation. You can also type out your question in the chat box, and I will again get to it sort of in the due course. You can also raise your hand using the reactions button there under Zoom at the bottom of your screen, and I can place you into the queue of questions. I'll be monitoring the questions and comments in the chat box and calling you to speak during the Q&A session, which occurs after the discussion. We want to address as many questions and comments as possible, so please be mindful, though, of the amount of time you're taking up on speaking. When asking questions, please try to avoid fact-specific questions about your particular circumstances. We're not acting as anyone's attorneys here. We're not giving legal advice during this program. This program is for informational and educational purposes and kind of to encourage open discussion. If you're camera shy or if we run out of time and you can't get to you, feel free to email us at m109@emergelawgroup.com. I'll also put that email address in the chat box. And yeah, with that, I know Dave and Sam have a number of interesting things they kind of want to talk about to sort of get us caught up about where things are at. So I'll kick it back to Dave to start the discussion.
Hello again, everybody. Thanks for joining, and thanks a lot for Sam, for agreeing to speak. And so, we usually kind of pick a subject and do a deeper legal analysis. I think now it's going to be less of we'll answer legal questions or general legal questions, of course, but I think this is more, I don't know, maybe like a news update as to where we are. So Sam, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us, most of us know, but tell a little bit about what you all are doing at the Healing Advocacy Fund.
Sure. Thanks, Sean and Dave. Again, my name is Sam Chapman. I was campaign manager for Measure 109. Prior to that, I've been involved in progressive drug policy reform for well over a decade at the federal, state, and local levels. I now serve as the executive director, as mentioned, for the Healing Advocacy Fund. This is a 501c3 organization that is really focused on supporting the implementation process, providing resources, education, materials for anyone and everyone who needs it. That's from the general public to government agencies to the recent wave of localities that are seemingly starting to get up to speed on what Measure 109 isn't, and what their authorities are. And so I do a lot of those things on a daily basis, but again, I think a lot of what we'll talk about here is related to current and future rulemaking, local control, and anything and everything that is licensing and the program itself. I think really excited to be the first state to move forward with creating and establishing a state legal, licensed, and regulated psilocybin therapy program. And with that said, we have a serious responsibility to get things right out of the gate here. Not perfect, but right. To lay a foundation that really centers safety and access simultaneously, which is easier said than done. So yeah, just really happy to be here, happy to be a resource. And for those who want to look into more of what we do or reach out to connect with us, especially if you're in a city or a county that may be considering opting out of the program, I do encourage you to reach out. You can contact us at healingadvocacyfund.org. And with that, Dave, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah. So Sam, before today's webinar, Sam and I and Sean put together a little short agenda of the, I guess, what we would view as the hottest topics that are happening right now. And at the top of the list was the local jurisdiction opt-out phenomena that's seems to have taken hold with a lot of jurisdictions. So Sam, I don't know, why don't you just give us your thoughts on how things are going? I attended the Deschutes County hearing, well, via Zoom. I attended the Deschutes County hearing, I guess it was last week. It was interesting to view. There were a whole line of very compelling folks who were testifying about the benefits of psilocybin, one after another. It was some pretty powerful stuff. But at the end of the day, it sort of seemed to me that the commissioners were more interested in land use technicalities than they were about the benefits or the value of psilocybin, at least 2 out of the 3 commissioners. And then yesterday morning, Jackson County had a similar open forum hearing. I attended that via Zoom too, and it was the same thing. I mean, a great bunch of folks got up and spoke. I think there were 25 or 27 folks supporting or urging the commissioners to not adopt an ordinance. And I think there were maybe 2 folks who were sort of on the, hey, let's opt out argument. But of course, they're, similar thing. I think the commissioners just said, hey, it seemed to me like it wasn't so much about the benefits or detriments of psilocybin. It was more about other issues, namely perhaps land use, like I said, and then I think in Jackson County, they've got a really tough problem with the illegal cannabis grows, which I think are, despite the massive differences between cannabis and psilocybin, they're conflating them, and it's a little bit of a scare thing going on. So this probably all leads to education. But what do you think about the opt-outs in general? And you know, it looks like we're going to have a couple campaigns ahead of us again. And what are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, so if it's okay, I'm just going to show a couple of slides from the deck that I use often in educating local governments. I don't know if folks can see that. Is that there? I just want to provide some context. So under Measure 109, for those who have not read every line for line there, I'm sure most probably haven't. It's a thick document. Local cities and counties have the ability to opt out of the program if they so choose to. Measure 109 opts them in automatically. And so they kind of have three general options. The first is they don't actually have to do anything necessarily. There's provisions that are already built in the measure that speak to sensitive uses, and I'll show a slide in a second. But if they want to opt out of the program, they can. Specifically, they can opt out regarding service centers and manufacturers, right? So the process for them to do that is, well, actually, I'll talk about the process in a second. These are a couple of the specific public safety and restrictions generally that exist in the measure. When Dave says we're starting with education, it's literally reminding local governments that these already exist, right? There's not going to be psilocybin services within 1,000 feet of a school. There's restrictions on manufacturers being in mixed-use properties, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really important that they understand that. And what their role is or isn't. And so the process for them to opt out is, one, they need to vote themselves, whether or not they want to send it to the next general election. So it's this two-step process. As Dave has mentioned, Jackson County, Deschutes, and a handful of other jurisdictions have already made the decision to send the question to their local residents for a vote this coming November. And so I highlight this specific map for a couple of reasons. The main reason being that some of these areas, as the ones I just mentioned, Deschutes County, you'll see voted in favor of Measure 109, 52.6%, as well as Jackson, 51.1%, right? Those were not slam dunk wins, but a majority of people spoke in those counties and they voted for it. Despite that support, the county commissioners have still decided to ask voters again to vote whether or not they want to allow these businesses in their jurisdictions. Other counties that are also considering this, unfortunately, are Washington County. Washington County voted 59% in favor of this, yet county commissioners are still considering opting out of the program. And there's a couple of reasons why they're considering that. The main one is there's a lot of information that's being thrown at them all at once. I can say that there have been multiple opportunities for cities and counties to engage in this process, right? Rule process has been going on for a year and a half. And so it's not as though they did not have opportunities to get up to speed much earlier. Obviously, there's been a lot going on, so we don't necessarily hold it against them. But there is a will of the voters question here that I think is coming up. And Deschutes specifically, we're actually seeing both of the commissioners that voted to send this to the ballot now have challengers in Deschutes County on this issue specifically. And so I do think that, as Dave kind of highlighted, it's going to be a politically charged environment at the local level moving forward here. And I do think that, above and beyond basic education on what the measure is, what it isn't, this is not like cannabis. Psilocybin will not be leaving facilities. There are no retail sales, et cetera, are the types of educational points that are resonating with some, but not all localities. There are definitely some that are doing the right thing. The city of Ashland, decided that they were going to allow these businesses when originally they were considering potentially opting out. I can tell you that both the city of Beaverton and Hillsborough are also interested in drafting time, place, and manner regulations. And there's a host of others. I'm sure our Emerge colleagues here will reference some resources for those who are interested in keeping track of those later on in the call. But I did just want to highlight this map here for those who may not be familiar with how a county voted on this measure. What I'll also say, and then I'll turn it back to Dave, is, this map for cannabis looks very, very different when adult use cannabis first passed. And I think it really highlights, despite the fact that obviously Eastern Oregon is still generally a no on these types of issues, the fact that we had just under half of all counties in Oregon vote in favor of psilocybin therapy, I really think highlights the fact that, psychedelic medicine in general is starting to transcend partisan politics in a way that cannabis hasn't, and may not ever be able to transcend some of those partisan divides. And so I do think that while we have a lot of work to do in some of these areas that do not want to allow access, even when majority of their residents supported it, these are numbers that are encouraging, but it's also a reminder that just because a majority of residents support it doesn't mean local governments don't have the ability to still impede, if not prevent, access entirely. And so I think that's really important that folks who are interested in participating in this space, whether it be getting a license or investing or receiving services, are aware of the political and policy realities here. I said this over the last decade of my work in drug policy. If you are dealing with a Schedule I substance at the federal level, like psilocybin or cannabis, whether you like it or not, your business is politics. All politics are local. And if you're not paying attention to local politics, you're not paying attention to your business. On that, powerful words of encouragement, I'll hand it back to Dave for the next question. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, so what Sam was referencing is our firm has collaborated with another website, and we're putting together this interactive map on local jurisdictions. It's technically up, but we got some fine tuning to do. And I think on Monday we're going to post a blog about it and send links around, and it'll basically be this color-coded map, not unlike what you just saw from Sam, but basically be an updated thing that we're going to keep updated by the day on what jurisdictions have opted out, what jurisdictions are still considering opting out, what jurisdictions are basically, I would just call them safe zones, where they've had a, example, City of Ashland has talked about it and made a decision, right? Lane County has talked about it and made a decision. Sam, I don't know if Multnomah County or City of Portland have even talked about it. We pretty much know they're not going to opt out, but I would consider I suppose there's some good news here. Sam, has there been any pleasant surprises to your knowledge about jurisdictions who might have been on the fence who have said, no, we're not going to opt out. We'll sort of start a dialogue about time, place, and manner, but we're not going to send anything to the voters.
Yeah, I think it's still early. There are some very specific timelines that localities have to make a decision, and it's essentially like early September. There's a couple of other timelines that folks should be aware of there too. But there's two that I just mentioned that are somewhat in the Portland metro area: Hillsborough and Beaverton. Those are not small cities that stand to provide a lot of access for folks. Both are interested in starting to draft time, place, and manner regulations, and so that's a really good sign. I think. There's just so much work to do in all of these places, and it's there's only so much of us doing this work with limited capacity too. So it's a challenge just to get these things prioritized to a certain degree. But I do think that we're starting to see some of the localities really understand. One, they don't want to buck the will of their own voters. I don't think voters like to vote on things twice generally. And two, I think, which has also been mentioned, a lot of these folks just kind of have, some past trauma with going through this with cannabis, right? And so that's really where educating them on how this is different, whether it's from a production standpoint or a retail standpoint, are some of the main areas. But I think we've got a long ways to go until we have a full, board of wins and losses, frankly, and really with nothing as a loss until November. That is one of the beautiful things about Measure 109, is that it's a two-step process and it forces people to go to the ballot to reaffirm the votes. And I think, we're starting to, look at, what advocates can be doing in that regard too. I think, it's still somewhat surprising to me that some of the areas that are thinking about opting out that have upwards of 60% support they just don't quite get it yet. By sending that back to the voters, it's not going to look very good. Like if it's 59, 60%, that will fail without question in my mind. And so I think there's a lot of work to do still, and they still have, about a month left to go through their own process, to hear from constituents, some of which are more willing to hear from constituents than others. You got to really pay attention to meetings and notices and how the process works for each individual jurisdiction. So if you have not gotten in touch with your local jurisdiction, you're interested in securing services in your locality, either from a provider or a recipient perspective, I highly encourage you to get connected with your local leaders and figure out where they're at on this. And I think we're happy to help provide resources for that too.
Yeah, something you said, Sam, I wanted to amplify too, is like actually these time, place, and manner restrictions are a good sign. That means that they're not opting out. They're saying, okay, like in what ways do we want to allow this? In putting together the map that's going to be rolled out with psychedelic alpha, with tremendous help from Jenna, by the way, our legal intern, who's Lawsuit News in the audience today. She's been doing a lot of the heavy lifting there. We're trying to figure out like, what is a green light? Is there a green light? Because the way the measure is set up, if you do nothing, you're opted in. So like, how do you prove a negative? You're waiting for somebody to do nothing. There's not a lot of these jurisdictions that are going to vote and say, yes, it's allowed. But if you start to see, okay, they're contemplating how they will allow it, that's maybe one of the closer things we'll get to a green light.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Sean. I was literally this morning, I was at the Metropolitan Mayors Association meeting presenting to about 8 different mayors. Lake Oswego, West Lynn actually reported that they're doing nothing at the moment, which was great. They currently don't allow cannabis businesses, I don't believe. I think that I think you're right, it's gonna be tricky. There's not gonna be a bright green light. It's gonna be an interpretation to a certain degree. One of the things that will help provide a lot of foundation in this process is the OHA publishing the land use compatibility statement document that will be required for anyone who wants to submit a full application of the OHA. The LUX, as it's also referred to, is something that you will send to your local jurisdiction should they have not opted out, that has your prospective address on it, and it will confirm whether or not your proposed business in its zone is compatible with existing code, which is one scenario where a locality may not develop a whole set of time, place, and manners, but instead they just add psilocybin to medical facilities or other production facilities, right? That's actually probably one of the easier ways for planning staff to preserve their own capacity right now, which after having talked to about 40 planners in the last 6 months, they have little capacity these days, especially for new big issues like this. But there's a lot of really good planners out there that want to do the right thing too. So there's that aspect of it. And I think that the devil is often in the details there, but the LUX, I think, will be really helpful. That will be a tool that people can then use to get a response from their planning department. And I'm sure that the good folks that emerge, in fact, I know for a fact, have a ton of experience navigating that process. So I'd encourage you to, what other legal questions you may have about that, to reach out to them.
Well, jurisdiction opting out or not opting out is part of it. But what Sam and Sean are alluding to is just because Multnomah County is not opting out doesn't mean that you can locate your manufacturing facility or your service center anywhere in Multnomah County. There are zoning restrictions, and there will be some perhaps time, place, and manner restrictions. So, for example, the Act, Measure 109, says that a service center can't be within 1,000 feet of a school. Great. But Multnomah County could come in and say, well, you can't be within 1,500 feet of a school, or you can't be within 1,000 feet of a church, or they could come up with other things that would restrict the physical locations where you could be. And the chicken and the egg issue here is you can't apply for a service center application with the OHA for a service center or manufacturing without a premises. So you have to lock down a premises. Now that means buying a piece of property, which, you know, you might want to be darn sure that you're okay before you do that, or leasing a piece of property, or optioning a piece of property, subject to getting clearance from both the local jurisdiction. So we went through this all on cannabis. I have two land use colleagues who, back in the cannabis days, you know, our mantra to all of our clients was, before you make a commitment on a piece of property, there's ways to hedge your bets there, but before you make a commitment, let us do a land use analysis. And our land use person would give you a green light, or a yellow light, or a red light.
Yeah, or one of my favorites was, if you have a landlord who's savvy enough or sympathetic enough, that you enter a lease that's contingent on your Lux being approved, and if you don't get your Lux, then you can back off. That's not every landlord's going to do that, but if you can do that, that's ideal.
And you can always option property, or option have a contingent lease. There's ways to sort of hedge your bets and to not get basically screwed by entering into some long-term lease or buying a piece of property, and lo and behold, you know, it's not, you can't do with it what you intended. So you know, finding a jurisdiction that has not opted out is part of it. The other part of it is sort of just good old-fashioned land use and zoning. Sam, you were part of a very well-run campaign for Measure 109. I sort of was on the outside of that, and I was on the outside of the Measure 91 cannabis campaign too. But I was a novice back then, but I was always impressed at like what a well-oiled, disciplined machine that was. You know, stay on top. I mean, basically there was this well-funded political action committee who was running the show. The local jurisdictions, you know, the folks in Jackson County, the folks in Deschutes County, the folks in other counties who now they know they're headed to the ballot. Do you have any suggestions for, you know, how those folks might get together and form? I mean, we have a few months. Now it's a public education game, and as opposed to educating the commissioners. You can still educate the commissioners if you want to, but really the campaign is now going to the people. But for folks who haven't, you know, been on the inside of political campaigns, like, I don't know, are there any major tips that you can suggest for folks?
Yeah, really good question, Dave. I mean, it is the strategy is to retool the strategy that won at the state level, which is to, you know, first kind of identify the messages that resonate most. I think that there's probably some polling that is worth doing and raising money for. So in terms of what can people be doing right now, start to raise some money. Polling isn't cheap, but it's not going to cost a full arm and a leg. You know, I would target, a couple of $1,000s for a jurisdiction might be able to figure something out. You know, there's folks that are out there in the political space that were also involved with the campaign that are going to be helping figure out how to navigate that. But I think the first question is really identifying where can we win? Where can the community win, right? Like, is this something that, you know, can actually win? Yes or no? And if the answer is yes, the question then becomes how. What are the messages that resonate with the people who either fall into one of two camps in my mind? The first camp, they voted yes on Measure 109 and they continue to believe in it, right? We have a lot of access to those folks. We have resources to reconnect with them from the campaign. And that's the lowest hanging fruit in terms of being able to leverage, their interest in seeing this in their community and activate them as advocates for their community. And so, I think sticking to a lot of the messaging that we had during the campaign is gonna double down now. I think conversely, but just as important, if not more important, is not getting off message. There are many, many, many opportunities to get off message on this. And I think understandably, I think a lot of people want to talk about, cannabis and maybe how cannabis has been good for their community. There are certain places where maybe that'll work. most places it probably will not be a good idea to mention cannabis. One, because this is so different, and two, the pitch for how cannabis helps people is just also very different than from psilocybin, right? We don't have any federal research. The FDA has not granted any breakthrough therapy designation for cannabis, right? It has for psilocybin. That resonates with voters and folks. And so turning out the vote of supporters is going to be one of the key aspects here, especially in areas that have a slim majority in support of the measure on its own. And then, what's going to make or break a campaign in some of those areas is going to be some of the folks that maybe supported it, but now they just have some questions that they just want to shore up to ensure that they fully understand what's happening. And I think anyone in their right mind who's generally supportive but has questions can be won over with time and information. And so those are the folks that I really think need to be identified and targeted. And then it's a simple, get them out to vote come November. So the overall strategy is that less is going to be more. Don't try and go convince people who hate psilocybin or don't trust anything that anyone says. There's plenty of those folks out there. Those are not people worth spending much, if any, time on. I do think that a lot of these areas have the chance to win, and it's going to be a question of, did we stay focused? Did we organize? And were we able to execute what the plan was? So, stay tuned. I do think that there are going to be, folks and entities that worked very hard on the campaign. They're going to be able to help provide infrastructure for some of those local campaigns. I don't necessarily think they're going to run the campaigns. I think that, Jackson County is a perfect example. There is a growing contingent. I see some of the folks on this call actually from Jackson County that have done an incredible job standing up on behalf of their community, advocating for access. And despite the fact that Jackson County has sent this back to the voters, I do believe in the people of Jackson County and the organizing that they are already off and doing can very well make the difference in ensuring that Jackson County has access out of the gate to this program.
All right, so moving on, I guess, from the opt-outs, of course, so anybody can ask questions about that in a little bit here. But Sam, I was going to ask about the HEC issue and the training courses. That was sort of a bit of a surprise to folks. And I know, can you give us the latest update on that? And I know they had a couple issues with insurance and certain other things.
And maybe to explain a little bit to those who aren't familiar. So what heck is heck? What the heck?
That's right. Yeah, ahead, there could be a whole seminar on what the heck is heck. So from the 100,000 foot level, diving in here, the measure contemplates all training programs being certified by the Oregon Health Authority. There was some diligence that was being done during the rulemaking process, just on Measure 109 in general, and it was flagged that the definition of training program actually exists in other parts of Oregon statute that ties in the Higher Education Commission, essentially, which is in charge of licensing, not certifying, but licensing all training programs that don't have their own special board, right? So there's numerous professions out there that don't have their own licensing board that all go through the Higher Education Commission to be a licensed training program. And it turns out that that definition also made this apply, the HEC requirement for licensure apply to Oregon psilocybin training programs. When we first heard about this and we did an initial pass on what it takes to get through the HEC process, it was startling to say the least. Startling because, the whole reason why the advisory board and the communities and advocates work with the Oregon Health Authority to get training rules advanced ahead of other rules is so training programs can actually be up and running and start training people now, right? That was the idea, is to be able to produce enough cohorts so by the time service centers open later in 2023, they can actually be providing services at some point in 2023. When we looked at the typical HEC timeline in which they were processing other training programs, it was a 9-month process. Now, we've made a lot of progress since then. It is still a lengthy process to be licensed by HEC. Let me be clear. And it is still going to take time and additional funds that many training programs did not anticipate. With that being said, I am very excited to say that HEC, OHA, training programs, HAF, and other community members have all come together in a very productive manner to identify and address and agree on what the problem is, primarily the timelines in which it was going to take and push training programs out. And HEC has been incredibly gracious to work with us on this problem to provide solutions to at least the timeline issue. So training programs could still get up and running within the next couple of months, and either receive temporary licensure from HEC that then would allow them to get up and running now that they can move into full licensure down the road. So basically we went from a 8 to 9 month process to a 2-month process. And we're not out of the woods yet. There's still more work to do with HEC. But the fact that everyone came to the table, acknowledged the problem, and has been working really well together with agencies that size, that doesn't ever really happen. Especially for, an issue like ours. I mean, it's new, and a lot of people are getting up to speed on just what the measure is, let alone how these training programs apply to other existing agencies outside of the OHA. And so are there still more hurdles for training programs to go over and work through? Yes, absolutely. I will tell you that, between, good folks like Emerge that are also deeply emerged into that process, along with, HAF has also convened a table of training programs. If you are interested in becoming, or are in the process of becoming, or have been certified as a training program, please reach out to the Healing Advocacy Fund. We'd be happy to get you plugged into that table and into that process. I think the more that HEC hears from training programs and what they already are struggling with above and beyond a HEC licensure process, from 280E to licensure to doing something like this for the first time, the more that they hear about the need for licensure and the uniqueness of this space, especially as it relates to psilocybin and being training programs, I think the more success we'll continue to see in developing solutions that work for everyone.
And the OHA sent around a couple bulletins on this, and also sort of an exemption application. It's in the HEC statute. I have pored over that exemption statute in the HEC statute many times. I've consulted with other attorneys outside of Emerge. One of my compliance colleague, Alex Berger, and I were on the phone. HEC, we sat on the phone for an hour and a half with HEC. They voluntarily, with like 3 or 4 people from HEC and a DOJ attorney, were talking with us. And I was surprised how long they were willing to talk with us. But we were going through exemptions and trying to brainstorm, and they seemed half sympathetic, like trying to work with us on an exemption. But there just didn't seem to be any. The only one that we landed on that I think, and they weren't even solid on this, is training your own employees. So this doesn't help out companies who have training programs, but if you were a service center and you had a thing where you were going to train your own employees, not for profit and not a for-profit operation, but theoretically that is the one exemption, I think, in the HEC statute where you actually have a shot in hell at getting an exemption. So we haven't followed through on that yet, but that's that might help out a limited number of folks. It does not help out the training programs. There was something about trade associations and things, but they just were never going to fly after talking with DOJ and other attorneys. So, this is HEC and the local jurisdiction opt-out situation and land use issues are just unfortunately kind of looks to me like it's slowing things down, right? I mean, it's hard to put together a business. It's hard to raise financing when there's a couple uncertain balls in the air with respect to timing. And so, we should all try to keep moving, but I have a feeling like come 2023, things aren't going to happen as rapidly as we thought they might, a year ago.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. I mean, heck, only taking a step back, heck is this body that was created because the people of Oregon feel it's important that a training program that's taking money from people, promising them that they will come out with some sort of certification that allows them to pursue a professional job. That's a regulated thing. So I guess it just makes sense that this is sort of a bump, and that facilitators, many of them will fall into that, and it's something that will probably be good. It's just definitely slowing things down. It's nice to hear about that collaborative kind of conversation, though, Sam.
All right, Sam, just to continue with our conversation here for a few more minutes before we open up the Q&A. Any general thoughts on what I'm calling sort of the phase 1 rules that the OHA has already adopted? Were you generally pleased with those? And then with respect to what's coming down the pike for the phase 2 rules, I know that the Psilocybin Advisory Board it's on the OHA's website, a laundry list of recommendations. A couple of weeks ago, the OHA had these 3 listening sessions where they were just opening it up to the public to make suggestions about rules. I submitted I'm going to post this on the blog early next week. I personally submitted a half a dozen recommendations. They're hyper technical in nature, but where folks, I thought, could, based on certain licensing rules, it would give companies a better, more flexibility to deal with 280E. It was purely a 280E tax thing and a corporate organizational structure thing, which has gotten almost zero, concern out of anybody. So hopefully that what I was suggesting won't be controversial, and the OHA will just do it. But any thoughts, Sam, on just the rulemaking? How's the OHA been? Are you satisfied with the phase 1 rules? Any major issues or concerns coming up with the phase 2 rules?
Yeah, so regarding the rules that have been codified on training, products, and testing, as someone who has over 10 years of experience working with the OHA on many issues and rulemaking processes for first-time industries, I was pretty happy with what the rules looked like. I think that I also, as someone who started out in this space as a volunteer advocate with no experience in that, I could understand how some people weren't necessarily happy, right? There's a lot of folks that, were very, not pleased with only, psilocybin cubensis being the first strain, right? Like, I get it. I agree that there are absolutely potential real benefits to strain diversity. And I also think that we can only get so much into the foundation of this program before we can do our checks and balances to ensure that we did a thing right before expansion. I think that it's easy to kind of forget about the full scope of this as the first state that's moving forward. And I think that, again, taking our responsibility seriously as the first state to move forward was really reflected, I think, in those first codified rules that existed as well. So, I was really pleased to see, a lot of the recommendations be accepted regarding training. Anyone who is following along the process knows that scope of practice has been an incredibly thick and vital conversation in terms of ensuring, that people stay within their scope within facilitation, right? We very much expect there to be licensed mental health care professionals existing in this space. And, it's going to be important that there's clear lines there between, these services and other existing services in the mental health therapy space as well. So I also want to say that, from an advisory board recommendations to rules perspective, it was also really pleasant to see that at least 85-90% of the recommendations that were made by the board were turned into rules. I don't think that's very common, frankly. And I do think that, while, maybe we're not going to, we will not have a perfect system out of the gate, it will be a solid foundation. And, I do look forward to the remaining rules coming out. I do think, based on the first set being just about 90% of what the recommendations were, we can generally expect the same in the second set, to the extent there are recommendations there. I think we'll be watching very closely for the second draft rules to come out. And frankly, from an HAF perspective, the question is like, do we have a solid foundation of safety? I'm confident that we'll get there, but I think that there are going to be questions to make sure that out of the gate, we're really doing everything we can to ensure that safety is the foundation of everything, in addition to ensuring that people have access, right? Which gets back to the local government control and ensuring that, we are working with communities who stand to benefit the most from having access to this, right? I think a lot of people were rightfully upset that this program doesn't come fully funded, that insurance is not going to cover these services out of the gate anytime soon. Those are realities of a new, modality coming into a state level licensed and regulated space. I think in the short term, access to these modalities is going to be determined by communities that, can support each other in getting access to these, whether it's ensuring that, folks from the BIPOC community have access to facilitators from their community, whether it be ensuring that terminally ill cancer patients in hospice or palliative care have the right needs and training for, their delicate situation, all the way across the board. So overall, I was pretty happy with that first set of rules. We'll be looking closely at the second set as they come out. And I suspect we'll be weighing in with those as well, with a real focus on safety and ensuring that folks really, center that in every aspect of this work.
And I suspect that when the rule, I mean, what I heard from a number of folks on this, from city councils or county commissioners, it was, hey, we don't know what the rules are yet, right? I mean, they're not published yet. So I suspect that when the rules are, at least the first draft of the rules are published, which will be, when the OHA publishes their rules, there is a procedure they have to go through. They have, rules advisory committees, they have public comment period, and then they publish the final version. And I think, Sam, we know that they can't deviate that much from the published rules, because if they did, they'd have to go back to the, start the whole process again. So I think when they come up with their draft rules, by and large, they'll change them to some degree, just like they did for the phase 1 rules, but they won't be, a complete overhaul. And so we'll have a general idea of what's happening, which I think might play into the local campaigns, where you could, maybe take away that argument from some of the folks who are saying, we don't know what the heck this is. And you can point to the safety arguments that are presumably going to be in the rules, but not just recommendations from the board or what we try to tell them, don't worry about it, it's going to be fine. They'll be in black and white from the OHA. So last thing on that, Sam, any update on the timing? Is the OHA's calendar correct? Like when are you hearing that the next the draft rules might come out?
Yeah, so amazingly, the OHA has stuck pretty closely to the timeline that they published at the beginning of this entire process. I do believe that we'll have the final rules codified by the end of the year here. There's no reason to think that won't happen. In terms of when the first draft of the final set of draft rules comes out, it's going to be right before the Rules Advisory Committee that happens, which I believe is in early September. So expect the first draft maybe in the next month or so, give or take a little bit. But I think that's probably the timeline that we're looking at. And then, as Dave mentioned, draft rules come out, Rules Advisory Committee convenes, public comment happens, a second draft with final revisions will then come out. They'll go through a final public comment process again, and then they'll start to codify things from there.
And I have a feeling that the next set of rules, the OHA has obviously 2 installments, but I think the second half of the rules, just from a sheer volume perspective, are going to be like way more than the first rule. I think it's not like they just wrote half the rules. I think they probably wrote like 10% or 20% of the rules, and the sheer number of provisions that will have to be read and digest are going to be a lot more, I think, just because they're going to cover all the nitpicky stuff.
I mean, we still got to cover facilitators and service centers just to begin with. Like, what is an administration session? I'm very, very eager to see what they come up with.
Oh yeah, it's going to be super interesting, because I think, you know, folks who have ideas about how they're going to run their businesses are now going to have to read all these rules and figure out if some of this makes sense, or whether the industry or HAF or anybody should sort of push back on some of this stuff and say, hey, you don't need to do that. We'd be better off if you did this. So that's what the whole comment period is for. So, okay. Last thing for you, Sam, before we open it up, I just curious, you know, have you heard anything from the Oregon U.S. Attorney from Oregon? Federal law, we had a deep dive webinar about this three months or so ago, and interesting sort of, I suppose, academic issue, as long as nothing happens. But in Measure 109, there is one provision that says, hey, the OHA is going to reach out to the U.S. Attorney and initiate a conversation to discuss Measure 109. Do you know if that's happened yet, or not, or if somebody sent an email and, you know, nobody got back to them? But is the U.S. Attorney, do they know what's going on? Does anybody care? Is anybody talking to anybody, or is everyone just, you know, doing nothing?
I can't answer the question to whether or not OHA has reached out, but, you know, I'm sure the U.S. Attorney is aware. Whether or not we're actually going to get a response from them, time will tell. I don't, you know, there's been a lot of speculation whether or not we'll get a Cole memo, you know, around psilocybin. I'm not holding my breath on that. And, you know, this is one of those situations where I think we're all prepared to have those conversations, and, you know, there may not be much of a conversation needed there. You know, the Measure 109 goes so much further to, you know, address potential types of concerns that we saw with cannabis in the Cole memo, right? Like, diversion is like darn near, you know, impossible from a certain degree compared to, you know, other things that we've seen. There's not, you know, the same type of interstate commerce concerns, you know, things of that nature. So time will tell, but, you know, I think right now, like, you know, I feel pretty good, and I think that the proof will continue to be in the pudding. Like, can we put our money where our mouth is in setting up a program that centers safety, you know, for everyone involved, including the general public? And I think the statute has a foundation of that. The rules are headed in that direction, and I think if we can continue to stay on that course, you know, I'm optimistic that we can continue to launch this program without any impediments from the federal government.